Well, good evening, everybody, and thank you for coming and attending. I'm really rather flattered there's so many out there. Yes, the battlefields of France. I think they tend to get rather ignored very often. I know many members of the Western Front Association are incredibly experienced battlefield tourists, but they tend to, I think it's true to say, British visitors tend to stick to British battlefields, which I can understand to an extent, but I think it's a real shame because we missed, by limiting ourselves purely to the British battlefields, we rather lose the fact that the British battle line at any one time, its longest extent, sorry, I picked a button I shouldn't have done, really only extended for about 100 miles, this area here. And the rest of the Western Front is this whole area down here, which was basically French maintained. And I think sometimes maybe the Western Front, we should be called the Western Front Association, because by visiting French battlefields, one sees very often far more than one sees at the rather laundered battlefields of Ypres and the Somme. So tonight, what I want to do is to take us on a very quick tour along the real extent of the French battlefields, which start here just south of the Somme and run all the way down through Compiègne, all this way down to the border with Switzerland. So that's what I'm going to be looking at tonight. And to start off with, I'm going to the Somme because I'm very conscious that many visitors, when they go to the Somme, don't really go south of the Somme, which of course is where the French were on July the 1st. And as soon as you get into the French, you find far more relics. This is a German bunker at a little village called La Chevatte. And as you can see from the marking, the tiles, indentations in the concrete, was actually built inside a house. It's completely intact, and it gives one an idea of the scale of German fortifications that they built. And there are quite, in this particular part of the Somme, there are quite a number of bunkers and remains from the French army and the German army. Right? And one of these is this really rather beautiful memorial in the town of Schoen, a really beautiful memorial to the 117th Regiment of Hesse. And the Germans, because of their permanent position along the Western Front, they tended to build some of these memorials, particularly around their cemeteries. Now, the next area that we're going to go to is this region north of the Aisne, along here. This is a range of limestone hills. This is the Chemin des Dames, this region. This is known as the Soissonnais, and this is the Noyonnais. And these limestone hills are very important from the French and German perspective, because during the medieval times, these were a major source of stone for French towns, and particularly for Paris. The stone would be floated down the Aisne to Paris. And during the war, these became a real place of refuge for both French and Germans. And one of the most extraordinary places, which is in private hands, so it's quite hard to visit, is known as the Carrière de la Botte. And this is a German position, which was effectively a salient into French lines. And you can follow the trench line through the woods as it juts into the French lines, but more remarkable are the underground workings, which go down on three levels, and the bottom level is actually was the supply route into this defensive position. And you can still see the remains of the Decauville railway that came in. And above it are two levels which go along underneath the German trench line. And the German commander was very conscious of his position and felt rather threatened. And he dug a fighting tunnel under the French lines. And it's quite extraordinary because you can, in fact, if you're prepared to risk it, you can get down into this fighting tunnel and go out under the French lines. It's about 35 meters deep, and the tunnel itself is about 100 meters long. So a quite remarkable experience of what life was like underground. In addition to the underground workings, the limestone lent itself to carving. And there's a remarkable remains all the way through this region, both German and French. This is in a French quarry, carved by a Frenchman. It's known as La Vie Parisienne. Obviously, the French Poilu were lusting after the mademoiselles of Paris, and this beautiful carving. And there it is to this day, completely untouched, just sitting in a wood, and really, really rather splendid. In the same quarry is this carving of a Poilu. You can see him here. He is guarding this trench line in the mountains. You can see the Poilu. There he is with his beard and his rifle. And he's got a pipe in his hand, and see the duck balls. All I love the detail is here is his rucksack with a rat after his cheese. It's really rather beautiful little detail. And it's a nice illustration of how very often memorials give you an insight into the soldier's life and what it was like. And outside this, the cavern which contains this carving, there is General Foch, Marshal Foch, on his horse, and you can see the extent of the quarry behind. Here's a barrack room. The stone was quarried underground. It was extracted underground because you've got better quality limestone where it hadn't been damaged by water and frost. And these are known as crête, and there are about 400 of them. And the largest one is about 1 kilometer in diameter. You can go down into it in a 4x4 and drive around. And in these quarries, you find carvings, graffiti, all sorts of things. Really quite amazing. And I mean, I've been visited about 20 of them, and I just never cease to be amazed by the variety that is there. Most of them now are in private hands because they were getting vandalized. So you do need special permission to go to them. But when you get there, they really are worthwhile because you do feel that you're touching a men of 14. It's extraordinary. And in the same region, some of you may have read a book called A Distant Mirror by Barbara Tuchman, which is about the life of the noble French nobility in the 14th century. And the hero of this is a man called Enguerrand de Coucy, whose motto was neither king nor duke nor prince am I, for I am the Sire de Coucy. And Coucy, the chateau, was in its time the biggest military fortification in Europe. And during the war, it's still there. It's a beautiful walled town with a castle. But in the foot of the castle is this gun emplacement for a Camamax. This was a French 380 millimeter naval gun. It's effectively a 15-inch naval gun. This is not Big Bertha. It is not the Paris gun. Big Bertha, in fact, was a howitzer. It's often mistakenly called the Paris gun. It's not. But the 380 millimeter, they were used along the Western Front. They were quite laborious to put in place. Initially, they had these concrete emplacements. And to give you an idea of the scale, these two grooves here are a railway track. Sorry, of course, are the railway tracks. So it gives you an idea of the scale of this weapon. Because the German Navy was basically tied up, they were manned by naval crews, commanded by an admiral of all strange things. But they had a range of about 30 miles. And in fact, they would in fact be developed into railway guns in a later stage of the war. And also developed into the Paris gun, which could, of course, fire a shell about 70 to 80 miles from the war. Also in these quarries, because the men had time to spare, religion became an important part, was an important part of their life. And there are a number of these beautiful chapels carved by the soldiers themselves. This is the chapel of Vive le Christ qui aimait les fonds. And it was carved by the French 50th and 121st Brigade. And you can see their battle honours, the scrolls of their battle honours as they are. These chapels now, as I said, they're all very carefully guarded and wired up. Just quite an extraordinary reflection on the men of the French soldiers of the First World War. Another memorial, which is close to the town of Soissons, it's in a cemetery at a place called Verdun, which is unusual. It is a French, German, and British cemetery. And here, under a Commonwealth War Graves Commission headstone, is Mrs. Gartside Tipping, who was killed whilst working for the French Red Cross. She was killed at the railway station in Soissons by obviously a mentally disturbed soldier, described as a soldat dérangé. And there she is buried. It's an unusual burial to come across in the cemetery. But she's interesting also because she was the widow of Henry Gartside Tipping, who was a lieutenant commander, became the oldest naval officer to be killed in the First World War. He's killed at the age of 67 off Zeebrugge. And about 3 miles away is another memorial, which is really rather splendid. You can see this rather dashing looking cavalry officer, Gaston de Gea. In September 1914, he's on a long-range cavalry patrol. He gets cut off behind the German advance from Mons down towards the Marne. He's cut off and he's taken refuge in a farmhouse. And at midnight, he's told that there's a German aircraft squadron has landed in some fields close by. So rather than go to bed, he gets up and he charges this squadron. And this is extraordinary. It's the First World War. It's cavalry on aircraft, and they destroy about 6 aircraft. And Gaston de Gea is killed. But I think it's just a splendid story. You can imagine that, attack à l'outrance, charging across the fields towards the Germans. Now, we often forget that at this stage of the war, the British were down on the Aisne, and in the Aisne, there is I think I've not come across anything quite like it. It's in the Carrière de l'Ours, and from left to right, you have a German regimental badge, a French regimental badge, and on the right, you have the regimental badge of the Hampshire Regiment. The badge is known as the Cat and Cabbage. It's a tiger above a rosette. And it was cut off by one of the soldiers, Sergeant Alfred Brisley. And what I find interesting about this is the fact that although they were enemies, French, British, and Germans, the Germans respected the regimental badges of the two units that had been there before. The British were there in September. They were followed by the French light infantry, regimental infantry, and then the Germans took over, and there it is. But I think it's a quite extraordinary memorial. And there it is, this carving in a cave, which is actually open. Now, one of my favorite books when I visit the Aisne, and I think it's one of the great memoirs of the First World War. It's written by a man called John Lucy, The Devil in the Drum. John Lucy, he's a young man. He enlists with his brother in the Royal Irish Rifles. And in September, they find themselves on the Aisne. And John Lucy writes, "My brother's platoon suddenly got the order, unheard of by me, and up went the men on the open grassland, led by their officer. Dennis went ahead, too far in front of his section, I thought. He carried his rifle at the high port and presented a good picture of the young leader going into battle. I shouted to him, 'Take care of yourself.' And I blushed at such a display of anxiety in the presence of my comrades. My brother steadied a moment and looked back over his shoulder, winked reassuringly at me. The bugger could wink. Forward he went, and out of my sight forever." A day later, he writes, another company took our place at the front, and we went underground into conveniently situated large caves, a little distance at the rear of our line. The medical officer had opened up his dressing station at the mouth of one cave and was already busy attending the wounded and the dead. The sound of battle heard from the caves was awe-inspiring. Clouds of smoke from bursting shells obscured the already dim light which filtered through the cave mouth. A hollow in the ground about 10 yards from the caves was filled with bandaged wounded. They did not seem very distressed. A rising, tearing noise like that of an approaching train heralded the arrival of a heavy shell. We crouched down where we were. We closed our teeth to the shattering burst which seemed right on top of us. I raised my head to see that the shell had exploded precisely over the hollow and killed every one of the wounded. This is the cave, and this is the hollow where Lucy is talking about. And it's still there. And his description of the landscape actually at this particular place, it really does make the hairs prickle on the back of your head, because when you read the book and you stand there, you realize the landscape that he describes has not changed in 100 years. It is quite an extraordinary place to visit. Now, landscape very often makes us rethink our history. And I'm sure many of you will have heard recently of the discovery of the German tunnel, the Winterberg, on the Chemin des Dames, which was where about 280 German soldiers died on May the 24th, 1917. Now, this is quite a significant date because we all know about the Nivelle offensive in April of 1917, which ends about the 28th of April, and how the French army mutinied and did nothing for some months. Well, if you go to the Winterberg, this gives a lie to that notion that the French were totally immobile after the French mutiny. This is a view taken from the Chemin des Dames, about 2 miles from the Winterberg. It's the German position as it was on April 17th when the French attacked, and the French attacked from this line here. This hill is about 100 meters high, and the French finally took the position from which this photograph is taken on June the 6th. Now, attacking across this ground, this is not a jolly walk across no man's land. This is uphill, which suggests that the attack at this position was a sustained, coordinated, and committed attack, effectively for 6 weeks. Now, our history would suggest that the French army mutinied. Maybe it had, maybe some units were disaffected, but there is no doubt about it that some French units were continuing to attack in the teeth of really fierce opposition from the Germans. And the Winterberg tunnel, as I said, is 2 miles from here, and that is further proof that the French attack on the Chemin des Dames did not falter because of the Nivelle mutiny. So we do sometimes need to rethink our history and look at it from other perspectives. Now, where we're now going to look at is the region. Sorry, I've seen it's getting a bit jerky, so there's obviously online a bit. We're looking here now at the Chemin des Dames down here, and in May of 1918, the Germans launched their Blucher offensive from the Chemin des Dames, and they drive down towards the Marne. Now, it's memorable from a British point of view because there were in fact 9 corps after the mauling it had taken in March and April of 1918 had been moved here to what was regarded as a quiet area. And when the Germans launched their attack on May the 27th, 4 divisions basically get rolled over and destroyed. 5 brigade commanders are either killed, wounded, or captured. And the Devonshires, who mount a very famous action, Bois de Butte, 4 days later, their muster is 52 men. They fought basically to the last man, as did the Gibraltar battery of the Royal Field Artillery, and they are commemorated there. And as you can see, the French gave them their art, really honoured them, and gave them the Croix de Guerre, as they did to the Devonshires. It's described the retreat and the actions of the Devonshires as it's described as, in the late hour of the morning, I found the commanding officer of the 2nd Devons and a handful of men holding the last trench. The commanding officer was calmly writing his orders with a perfect hell of high explosive all round him. I spoke to him, and he told me that nothing could be done. He refused all offers of help from my artillerymen and sent them off to get through if they could. His magnificent and dauntless courage and determination to carry on to the end moved one's emotion. The Devonshires, they lost 23 officers and 528 men killed, missing, or captured. So extraordinary action, and one of which they're very proud. And it is a battlefield which is really worth going to, because even to this day, you can actually see the trenches out of which the Devonshires held their last, made their last stand. Now, the Marne, of course, is incredibly important, because the Battle of the Marne, which ends in the Gonds Marshes in 1914, is probably the most significant battle of the First World War, because had the battle been won specifically, then the war would have changed. Had the Germans won the Battle of the Marne, then Paris would have fallen, France would have been knocked out of the war, and it would have been a whole different thing. Had we managed to defeat the Germans at the Battle of the Marne and force them back further than we did, then the war would have taken a whole different perspective. But it didn't. And the Marne again features in 1918, as I showed you earlier on, the Blucher offensive sweeps down from the Chemin de Gand. The Germans take about 40 miles of ground in 4 days, and they force them themselves onto the Marne. And here's the map. This is the Chemin de Gand up here, along here, and they force their way down. They cross, they get as far as Chateau Thierry. They cross the river here at Dormont, but here they're held. And there's a stalemate until the 15th of July, when the Ludendorff launches his sort of last desperate, what he called his peace offensive. He attacks to the east of Reims, and he attacks down here on the Marne at a place called Mézy. And the Germans cross at night, and they come up against the United States 3rd Division. And in particular, they come up against the 38th Infantry Regiment, which is commanded by a colonel with the splendid name of Ulysses Grant McAlexander. I think with names like Ulysses Grant McAlexander, you know what's going to happen. He told his men before the battle, "You may be killed, but no man can be licked until he wills to be licked." And McAlexander and his men held firm, and they became known as the Rock of the Marne. It was an extraordinary performance. It was really their first time in action. It was bitterly fought, and 24 hours later, the Germans are retreating back across the Marne. They've had such a bloody nose that they start to retreat. And on the 18th of July, General Mangin here launches an assault into the flanks of this salient, and here on the eastern flank. Now, this is an actual attack. It's very carefully coordinated. It's been put together at a great hurry. And as you can see, here they are on the 18th, the 18th of July, and they push forward. Now, what is important about this is that it's a reversal of German advances. It's the first reversal of German advances in 1918. We Brits tend to think about the Battle of Amiens, of course, on the 8th, as being the day when we start the 100 days and the Germans push back. But the Marne shows completely otherwise. And strangely enough, British troops are involved at this time. Here is a memorial. This is a totally forgotten memorial on the Butte Cramoiselle. It's actually to the King's Own Scottish borderers and the Argyll and Southern Highlanders, les troupes écossais, who attacked here in August of 1918. And after their attack, Mangin wrote, "You continue to advance step by step in spite of his resistance, and you held the ground won in spite of violent counterattacks. Then during the whole day of 1st of August, side by side with your French comrades, you stormed the ridge dominating the whole country between the Aisne and the Ourcq, which the defenders had received orders to hold at all costs. Having failed to take the ridge with his last reserves, the enemy had to beat a retreat, pursued and harassed for 12 kilometers." So I really do think we need to think of the Second Battle of the Marne as the turning point. The ground over which the Scottish, the King's Own Scottish borderers and the Argyll. This is the camera position from that memorial. It is looking westwards. So the Highlanders, they attacked across this field here and up this hill. So I think you can see that this is really a very, very significant feat of arms. And it's commemorated on this hill here by this memorial, which is Les Fantômes, the memorial to the men of the Marne. It's actually created by a man called Adowski. He was a French soldier in the First World War, and he actually goes on to design the statue of Jesus Christ at Rio de Janeiro. And looking at this particular position, it's actually the hills on the left-hand side of the photograph, which is where that Scottish memorial is. And it's really, as you can see, the ground they were attacking across was very open, so a considerable feat of arms. Now, another place which battlefield, and this is a very British battlefield, and I would be very interested to find out how many of you know of this ground, because it's really a forgotten battlefield. This is known as the Montan de Brine, and it's in a region called Tardenois. And on the 6th of June, during the retreat from the Chemin des Dames, after the debacle of May the 27th, the King's Shropshire Light Infantry are ordered to retake this hill because the Allied line as it retreats is in danger of breaking. The Shropshire Light Infantry are ordered to retake this hill, and they do so at the point of a bend. And they end up on the top of the hill, effectively 2 companies strong, and they hold the hill for about 12 hours. They're completely outflanked and they're forced to withdraw. Then on the 20th of July, the West Yorkshires are part of the attack up into the Marne salient, and they're ordered to attack this hill, and they do so again, and they take the hill again at the point of the bend. Montan de Brine, and it's quite extraordinary because the French give both the King's Shropshire Light Infantry and the West Yorkshires a unit croix de guerre. When you think that only 6 British units got unit croix de guerres during the First World War, to be given 2 croix de guerres for actions on the same piece of ground is quite extraordinary. And the Montagne de Brine, it's a beautiful battlefield to walk, lovely views. It's just on the edge of the Champagne region. And sadly, very, very few people visit it. But again, it is an extraordinary display or demonstration of the fact that Second Marne was really, Second Marne was, I think, the beginning of the end. Because if you look here, the attack goes in up the Ardres River with the Highland 8, the 51st Highland Division and the 62nd West Riding Division. They are here on the 18th of July. And 10 days later, they are 10 miles further up the valley. This is a significant advance. And if you look at it here, by the 6th of August, within 2 weeks, this whole salient has been pushed back. The Germans have been pushed back by about 40 miles, well, about 35 miles, actually, more accurately. So this is a considerable advance. And it's one that we really rather forget about. I think we're so keen to think of the Battle of Amiens as being the turning point. In fact, the eminent German historian, Professor Hans Delbruck, who wrote about the First World War history from a German perspective immediately after the First World War, he wrote, "The turn in our fortunes began with the collapse of our attack on Reims and the successful advance of the French north of the Marne." So the Germans definitely regard this as the time when their fortunes began to turn. Indeed, Amiens, we have Black Friday, but the Germans saw this as the turning point. And I think when you go and look at this landscape, it is very hard to say, no, this is unimportant. This really is, you have this major advance. And one has to bear in mind that the artillery bombardment for the offensive on the Chemin des Dames and also on the Marne had been organized by Bruchmüller. And Bruchmüller's massed artillery required huge logistical support. So to have a massed artillery bombardment with all your massed artillery, and then 24 hours later, you're having to pull it out, does suggest a certain degree of effective chaos. Now, where we're going to look at next, we've been down here on the Marne. We're going to be looking now at the region of Champagne. Now, we all think of the Champagne region as being around Reims. In fact, Champagne extends really as far across here as the Aisne. So it's a big area. And this is a battlefield which the French were fighting on for 4 years of the war. They never, ever gave up trying to attack here. And when you visit the battlefield, you'll come away horrified by the size of the cemeteries. They are massive. And one of the extraordinary places there is a place called Mont Cornier. And this is a ventilation shaft down into a quarry, which the Germans were using. And the French attack, again, they attack on the 17th of April, 1917, and they're still attacking a month later. And what happens here is a total tragedy for the Germans because the French hit this with a massive artillery shell. Interestingly enough, it was fired by a naval gun, but mounted on a canal barge, which the French kept in a canal tunnel. So when they wanted to fire it, they just pulled it out from the tunnel, would fire off it, whatever they wanted, and push it back in the tunnel. So they blocked this ventilation shaft. They also managed to block the entrance into the quarry underneath. And about 650 men died. And it was only in 1973 that French and German sapper engineers went in and cleared the tunnels out. So an extraordinary place up on the hills to the east of Reims. And very close to Mont Cornier is a quite unique memorial. This is the last battlefield grave on the Western Front. It's to Corporal Edouard Ivaldi. He's killed in April 1917. There's a plaque left there by his father in 1919 when the body was reinterred. But the grave is as it would have been when he was first buried. His helmet's atop the cross, and some of his equipment still lies at the foot of the cross. extraordinary place when you think that there would have been thousands of these during the war. This is the last one, and it's kept very, very closely guarded. I was very privileged. This is the first time it's been allowed to be photographed. When I photographed it, it was the first time it had ever been allowed to be photographed for reproduction. Because the French keep it very, very secret for, I think, obvious reasons. And on the other side of the coin, close by, is a little village called Machaut. Is, I think, probably one of the most beautiful memorials on the Western Front. This was a German field hospital at Machaut, and there is an angel of mercy giving water to a wounded soldier. Very beautiful memorial. Many German cemeteries have these memorials. Some have been sadly vandalized, but this one is still in almost perfect condition. And again, as an interesting little sidebar on history, yet a few miles away is a memorial to yet another nation, the Russians. This is a Russian memorial, and I think we very often forget about the Russian contribution to the First World War. Yes, we talk about the Eastern Front and the Bolsheviks and everything else, which tends to rather obscure history. But this is at a place called Saint-Hilaire-le-Grand. And the Russians, as part of their Franco-Russian treaty, which they made before the war, they sent 4 brigades to fight in France in 1916. And they performed very well. They obviously had problems when the Bolsheviks came to power. But I think the thing we need to consider, and of course, our relations with Russia ever since the war have been rather clouded by the fact that we opposed the Bolsheviks when they first came to power. By the end of 1915, something like 60% of German army manpower was on the Eastern Front. Now, if you think about that and just reflect, what would have happened if those men had been available to fight on the Western Front? You know, the British Army still isn't really a massive factor in the Allied war machine, because it wasn't until July of 16 that we really began to enter the war. If those men had been available on the Western Front in 1915, I think the war would have had a very, very different outcome. So I think sometimes we do need to reflect a little bit more about the Russian contribution to the overall war. So this memorial may not be significant, but in the context of the war, I think it's very important to think about the Russian contribution was made. Now, this is a village, the place called, it's now in a French military terrain, called a place called Sweep. These are some of the destroyed villages. This is a place called Liau, and it's open about 1 day a year. You have to effectively book a place to go in and be taken around by the military, because this is a live artillery and bombing range, and it is quite extraordinary what there is to be seen here. And you will actually find an extraordinary amount of remains, including, oddly enough, an RAF Halifax bomber from the Second World War is there. Now, one of the things of the First World War centenary is that, rather sadly, people sought to turn some of these sites into tourist attractions. And this is a classic example. This is a photograph taken in about 2010 at a place called Le Mans de Massige in Champagne. And if you went there, the ground was sort of disrupted, and you were in shrubbery and brush. And so I've got a slight technical problem here. I'm just going to go back and refresh this picture. Sorry about this. Not quite sure what's happening here. In 2012, a local farmer decided he was going to turn it into an attraction, and he went in, and with a digger, he created all sorts of this is getting maddening. I'm sorry, I'll not try to do it anymore. He went in with a digger and dug out those trenches, which was a shame, because what had been a rather historical piece of ground became a tourist attraction. And in fact, it's been on the cover of a book on the Western Front, and I know that it was in a calendar, a Western Front Association calendar. But believe you me, the trenches that you see at Les Mains de Massy today were dug out with a mini digger in 2012, and it destroyed an awful lot of archaeology, which is really a great shame. So do be careful when you go and look at some of these supposed First World War sites, because they're not quite what they seem to be. Now, this is a hospital building on the edge of the Argonne forest, and it shows the scale of German construction. This is taken from the corridor, looking down the corridor outside the hospital. It's on the side of the hill. This corridor is about 2 meters high, so you can get an idea of the thickness of the concrete. But the important thing is that this hospital, was very well equipped, is literally about 1,500 meters from the front line. So it meant the Germans, because of the static nature of their line, the fact they were regarded as a permanent position, were very, very well looked after and cared for. So this is a distinct sign of the scale of German fortifications and how carefully they built them. And this particular place is quite extraordinary, because if you had 20 men, you could have this hospital, and you had water and power, you could have this hospital up and running in 24 hours. It's an extraordinary condition it's still in. And close by is another extraordinary place. This is the Butte de Vauquois, which was atop of a hill. There was a village here in 1914 when the French and Germans arrived. The French side is on the north. I'm trying to move the cursor. I'm sorry, I am having technical problems. I do apologize for this. Right, there we go. I'm still having a technical problem, sorry. I'm not quite sure what's happening here. It's at my end. Let me just sort this out, please. My apologies. This is Vauquois. This is the French side, the steep-sided hill. This is the German side. So these are the German front lines, and these are the French front lines. And this is 44 paces between the lines. And they are here from November of 1914 through to September of 2018. And this is some of the most intensive mining warfare of the Western Front. This crater here was created by 60 tons of high explosive. And when you think that Schlieffen was created by about 40 tons, that gives you an idea of the scale. My apologies for the phone call. That's been dealt with. Thank you. Yes. It's an incredible place to visit, because on the German side, there are 25 kilometers of tunnels under this hill, both French and German. The deepest mine here is 104 meters deep. So it gives you an idea of the scale of the warfare that went on here. There were over 300 mine explosions along this hilltop. Quite remarkable. And in fact, the miners actually came to an agreement, a mutual agreement, whereby they would only blow mines at a certain time of the day. So the frontline troops would get out of the trench, walk back, wait for 10 minutes, and if nothing had gone, bang, they'd get back into the trenches and carry on as if nothing had happened. So an example of live and let live. But it is a remarkable place. If you do go to Verdun, this is a place you really must go to, is Vauquois, because the experience, the underground visit takes about 3 hours, and it's absolutely fascinating. It really is. The Germans could actually have a garrison of about 2,000 men underground. Quite extraordinary. And close by in the Argonne forest is a reminder of the results of war. This is on what they call the Voge, and this speaks for itself. And this ossuary of French soldiers, which was created by the wife of a French commanding officer that was killed here. And close by is another memory of war, and I don't know of anything else quite like this. This is an aircraft engine. This was an aircraft belonging to an American, Hamilton Coolidge, who, like many young Americans, when left his university to enlist, and he actually joined the U.S. Army Air Service in 1916. So a year before the Americans joined the war, he's preparing for war. He's left university from a wealthy family, and he was a friend of Quentin Roosevelt's, who was also, of course, killed, the son of President Roosevelt. And his aircraft is hit by an anti-aircraft shell and disintegrates. But his aircraft engine is still in the ground, and he's actually buried close by. And there it is. It sits there. He'd actually had 8 confirmed kills, so he was regarded as an ace. He was a very highly regarded pilot. But there is his engine. I don't know how much longer it's going to stay there, because I'm sure some collector is going to come along and steal it someday. But there it is in the ground. And Verdun, of course, is the great French battlefield, the battle within a battle. And this particular landscape, I think, is very significant, because it really does show what a battlefield looked like. We all people tend to think of trenches, etc., but this is the battlefield of Verdun as it was in the end of 1916. You didn't fight from trenches, you fought from shell holes. And there are accounts of men getting into craters in the middle of the night and looking over the edge of the crater at the shell hole in the morning and realizing the guy in the next shell hole has got the wrong shape of helmet on. So there was a lot of sort of mutual, if you like, live and let live. But it is an extraordinary place, and this is the face of a battlefield as it would have been after the war. And of course, Ypres and the Somme have largely been smoothed out by agriculture, and it's only in the French forest that you come across this. And Verdun, of course, is probably the one battlefield which we Brits do tend to visit quite regularly. And you have, the iconic Camamax casement, which, of course, was not there in 1916. They were introduced in 1917 as machine gun casement. They really, yes, they look rather like a medieval armored helmet, I think. And also in Verdun, here's an unusual relic. This is an observation tree, so you can still see it there with the climbing spikes available. So it shows a little bit of the scale of that. And we're now going to move on down here into the Saint-Maur salient and Lorraine. And the Saint-Maur salient here, of course, which is, sorry, I can't move my cursor, which is getting very annoying. And again, my apologies for the technical glitches. This is in the Saint-Maur forest, and it's a really unique piece of kit. This is actually a base plate for a crook armored gun. They were effectively fortress guns, but they made 8 of them for the Western Front. And this is the only one that's in existence. And you can see the scale of it. And one just wonders how it was they got it into position. But there it is. It's sitting in the forest in Saint-Maur. And it's typical of the German infrastructure that they built, which you begin to see the scale of it in fortifications like this. This is an artillery bunker near Saint-Maur. And close by is this ammunition bunker. You can see it's beautifully made by specialist teams. The British tended to make concrete bunkers and things with sort of local ground troops. The Germans actually have specialized concreting units, building bunkers, commanded, guys, betonmeisters, literally concrete masters. And some of them are really very, very rather splendid structures with a lot of ornamentation. But these are the scale of the trenches you can see here. This is at a place called Fleury, and these trenches are 10 feet deep. And you can see the nature and the permanency of the structures that they made. And this is another German trench. And this is one of the reasons why I say to people they really should visit some of these battlefields, because you begin to understand an awful lot about the nature of war and the battlefields and how they were organized. This is a German frontline trench. It's about 60 meters from the French frontline trench. But the significant thing to notice is, in fact, if you look on the right-hand side, you'll see there are two sort of boxes set into the trench. This is actually, if you like, a grenade dispensing box. This was a box in which you kept your potato mashers. So you can see how easy it would be, no groping around in the mud or pulling them out of a sandbag. You just literally have them lined up in a rack. It's an incredibly neat and organized system. So it does begin to help one understand the nature and how well organized the Germans could be when you see things like that. Now, this is a crater on a ridge overlooking the valley of the Verve. It's called Les Éparges, and there are about 28 of these craters. And this is bigger than Loch Nagar. And there are this whole hillside is just pockmarked with these craters. And you begin to realize the massive intensity of the war that took place. Now, the Germans, as I said, they were there, sort of, if you like, they weren't going to continue their attack and they weren't going to retreat. And here we are to place, these are known as Les Quatre Goulots, literally the four throats. And this is a German rest area in the Bois de Prêtre, near a place called Pont-à-Mousson. And it shows the permanency with which they thought they were going to be there, the care and attention that which they had done. And someone who was here and who actually would have washed in this was Ernst Junger. And this is a photograph of Ernst Junger, and he's standing next to his friend, Lieutenant Kleinitz. And his description is that I'd got together some kit appropriate to the sort of work I meant to be doing. Across my chest, 2 sandbags, each containing 4 stick bombs. And you can see the grenades sticking out of those bags. Impact fuses on the left, delay on the right. In my right tunic pocket, a revolver and a long cord. In my belt, spring hooks for pulling out the pins, plus a Bowie knife, which is clearly visible there in the front, and wire cutters. We'd removed shoulder straps and Gibraltar badges because his battalion had in fact fought under the Hanoverians at Gibraltar. So as to give our opponents no clue as to our regiment for identification, we had a white band round each arm. So we have a photograph here very clearly describing what's in the scene. Now, if you look in the bottom left-hand corner, you can see some lettering, and it is actually a well, and it's called the Puterquell. So here, today, is that very same spot, the Puterquell. And I don't know of many other places on the Western Front where you can actually find a photograph of an actual identified soldier who then writes about what he's doing and what his uniform is. And there it is still to this day. It's quite extraordinary. And nearby is the town of Pont-à-Mousson, in the middle of which is a memorial which reminds us of the American involvement, particularly American field ambulance service, who served here and very, very highly regarded by the French and they gave them this rather beautiful memorial in the center of the town square. Very, very beautiful memorial. And I'm a little bit conscious of the time, so I do need to crack on a bit. And here is another extraordinary place. This is a Schlieffen plan railway station. I think it's quite unique. I've not managed to find any other one. Was in about 3 miles inside the German border, because of course in 1914 they held Lorraine. So this is actually in what is now French Lorraine, but this was built as a military railway station. And if you look at the width of the platform, you can see that you pull a train in, and literally within 2 minutes you could have 1,000 men out on the platform with all their equipment, with their horses, and having ready to march. So it is a fantastic illustration of the care and planning which the Germans have made to the prospect of war. And this is in Lorraine, and of course in August 1914, the French plan was attaque à outrance, and they charged into Lorraine, and they advanced from the right-hand side of the photograph up the valley of the Saale, which we're looking out over. And this is where, if you like, Napoleon met the Maxim machine gun, because the French marched up. They were wearing their bright blue coats, flags flying, bands playing. The officers had white gloves and swords, and roughly on this camera position is where the Germans had their machine guns. And the French lost about 20,000 men. The Battle of Morange, and the French were commanded by de Castelnau, and it was a 2-day battle. And halfway through the battle, he was told that his son had been killed. And the accounts are that he stood there for a moment with the tears streaming down his face. And then he just said, "Gentlemen, we will continue." So yes, a moment of sort of poignancy in history. But this is, if you like, where warfare changed from the 18th and 19th centuries to the 20th century. Now, finally, we now go into the Voge Mountains, which are down here, beyond Nancy, going down to Basel in the bottom right-hand corner. Yes, I know that Strasbourg is not spelt Strasbourg, but yes, I'm sorry about that. But the Voge Mountains are a beautiful area, very seldom visited. And because they're up in high areas, inaccessible, there's a huge amount to be seen. This is called the Tête de Coquin, and it's a German observation post built on top of these rocks. You just look at the engineering and the skill of that and its position. And believe you me, this has the most fantastic observation over about 15 miles of country. It's quite extraordinary. And you can see how cleverly they blended it in with the rock. It is quite extraordinary. I mean, German engineering, you'll find this all the way through this region. This is actually a place called the Col de Chapelot. This is a telerific station. We're on top of a hill, and the slope in the right-hand side of the photograph, there was a cable car going down there, and this was the station for that telerific, which they brought their supplies up. And this particular position is actually just 400 meters from the front line. And here they had a complete rest camp. There's a chapel, there's a hospital, there's an officer's mess. There's absolutely everything, but just 400 meters from the front line. And this is the French position opposite it. You can see completely different nature, just literally rocks piled one on the other. So the German construction is, and also in the Vosges, this is next place. This is Petit Donna. This is a hilltop in the Vosges, held by the French and taken by the Germans in August of 1914. And it is quite extraordinary because you can see there it says a German soldier from the regiment, 120th Regiment. After the battle, the Germans marked, they had every single soldier, French and German, the position of their death was marked by a marker stone, which was carved by a stone carver who was with the unit. And There are 41 of these on the side of the hill. So you can actually follow the side of the battle, and virtually all of these, they're rather moving because they're sort of underneath a rock. You can imagine someone taking shelter and poking his head over and getting shot. But it is an extraordinary memorial to these men, and also a memoir of the battles. You can see is the way they fought, they inched their way up the hill. This is another extraordinary thing. This is an observation tower on a hilltop in the Vosges. I think it was probably built by the Americans. No local historian has got any record of when it was built, because it would obviously be a secret at the time. But it's so reminiscent of American, those Midwest water towers. I think it was probably built by the Americans who were here in 1918. But there it is, just in the woods. And totally surreal is this swimming pool. This is a German swimming pool, a place called Saint-Marie au Mines. And again, the proximity of the front line is quite remarkable, because the German front line is the line of trees on the left-hand side. And this swimming pool was built, obviously, for rest and recreation. And it's still in use today. And I think, again, a testament to German concrete. The swimming pool is still in good condition all those years later. And this is a rather beautiful lion in some woods. This is a German cemetery. He sits there. All of this area, there are so many things that you can see. I just don't have time to show them all. This is the fort of Mutzig near Strasbourg. And this in its time was the biggest military installation in the world. 5,000 men could be stationed here underground. And this is one of the Crook batteries there. And it's still open to the public, and it's a massive place, absolutely fascinating to go around. This is Tête de Faux, which is a bunker. In fact, this is the highest point of the Western Front in France. And you can see what it would have been like. Temperatures would have been -30, -40 here during the war. So not the best of places to be. This is a German bunker. And the French front line is 40 meters, is 40 paces on the other side of that bunker. And this is the telerifique, the winding station, which supplied that bunker on the top of this mountain. So again, showing the incredible command that the German had of their logistics. And down in the forest nearby is this beautiful cemetery, or abandoned cemetery, German cemetery, individual carts. Now this is a place called La Linge, and description of this is written by a man called Henri Belmont, French captain. The crest itself is occupied neither by them nor us. The rival trenches are face to face at a short distance on the rounded brow which forms the summit. Beneath these two lines, the ground has become a charnel house. The bodies of infantrymen who have fallen in the course of successive attacks and the bodies of Germans killed by our guns on recent counterattacks lie stretched in all positions amidst twisted barbed wire and felled pine trees. At certain times, the air is tainted with an abominable smell. My company is at the extremity of this crest on a steep and rocky slope which dips down. There's a sort of wall that has been built, a rampart of stones and bags of earth. Loopholes have been made in it, and we have succeeded in stretching a few strands of barbed wire in front. Well, in fact, I cannot get my cursor to move, which is really frustrating. I'm sorry about this. Here it comes. This, that was, let's see here. This is the French front line. This is the German front line. That is 28 feet, gentlemen, ladies and gentlemen, and they were there for 3 months. This is La Linge. It's an extraordinary place, extraordinary battlefield, high up in the Voge Mountains. But this gives you an idea of the nature of mountain warfare. Just 28 feet apart for 3 months. Quite extraordinary. Now, to the south of Linge is what is known as Hartmann's Villakoff, Vie Parisienne. Again, because it's in the mountains, it's so much to be seen. This is a Minenwerfer position, German mortar position. You can see the turntable there, and the basic zero aiming line still there after 100 years. It is quite extraordinary. And again, the quality, I was saying about the quality of German concrete, just look at how well constructed that is. And Hartmann's Villakopf was fought over for 4 years because, as you'll see from the next photograph, it was strategically very important because it's at the edge of the Voge Mountains overlooking the Rhine Valley. And if the French had been able to take it, they would have been able to look out over the Rhine Valley for 10, 12 miles. Extraordinary. But the Germans clung on. And there is a tour of this place takes 6 days, and you're never more than about 50 or 60 meters from something of interest. And one of the most fascinating things which I come across is there is a wire entanglement which is actually textbook laid out in squares, and it is still there 100 years later. And it's very interesting because there's a description. This is actually the lower rock formation called the Little Refhelsen, which you can just see in the top right-hand corner there. My cursor jumping about. And a German officer, Hans Schröder, wrote, "This time they're sending us to the crater of an active volcano. This volcano is the Hartmann's Villakopf. The opposing trenches are only a few yards away. One can talk to the French from them. Here our lines are protected by the electric current supplied from the Gebweiler power station. The night before last, the men connected up the French wire with our own. In the morning, they saw an enemy patrol hanging on their own wire." He then goes on, "We poured a continuous stream into the thick grey masses. Then we saw the foremost of them caught by the current of our wire entanglement. It was a ghastly sight. The attack broke down in less than 5 minutes. The 60 meters between our two front lines was covered with heaps, and for their sakes, I prayed for the swift arrival of nightfall so the enemy could get his wounded in. We had no intention of stopping them. A few entangled on our wire would have to wait because we could not risk switching off the current." Fascinating. It just shows that, the Germans, their use of industrial technological developments, quite how they electrified the wire, I haven't been able to establish, but you can in fact see the power cable in one of the trenches that leads up here. So an extraordinary insight, if you like, into the nature of warfare. And that's why I think the people who just limit themselves, if you like, to the British section actually miss an awful lot of context and some fantastic places with incredible things to be seen. And it's really, anyone who comes to these battlefields gets an amazing learning experience as to these things. And yes, so we've literally swept down over sort of 350 miles of Western Front, and I realize I've overrun time. So the final picture, this is a German trench, and this is point zero, because the field, the sunlit field that you can see at the end of the trees is Switzerland. And when I stood there taking this photograph, I wondered how many young German soldiers might have been tempted to make that desperate rush to get out of those trees and into the field at the end of the Western Front. So this is point zero, and that, if you like, is I've come to nothing. So this is the end of the talk. So thank you very much indeed for staying with me.
Mike, thanks very much indeed. That was absolutely fascinating. Really, really enjoyed that. Ladies and gentlemen, you can have to show your appreciation in the usual way by raising your hands on the Zoom software. And Mike, I can confirm that there's hands, hundreds of hands going up as a round of applause. So thanks very much indeed for that. Questions and answers. Karen, fire away with your question for Mike.
Right, my great grandfather were in 10 Scottish Rifles, and he died. He got killed in action on the 23rd of July 1918. They enlisted in Castleford in September 1914. Would he have been involved in this action that you've talked about tonight with the West Yorkshire Regiment? It came from Castleford in West Yorkshire.
And he's killed on the 23rd of July.
July, yeah, but he was in the 10 Scottish Rifles.
So that'll be the 15th Scottish Division, I think.
Yes, so he wouldn't have been there.
He wouldn't have been there, right, okay. Is there any books or anything I can read on the 10 Scottish that you know of?
I honestly, I don't know. Because
you don't know?
We're now talking about very specialist regimental knowledge, so I'm sorry, I can't help on that.
That's fine, thank you. Thank you.
Thanks, Karen. Thanks. Ian, just unmute yourself there.
Yep.
Hi, Ian.
Hello. Thanks for a really lively and interesting presentation. I love the photos. Great show. I was curious though, is there anything left seeing remaining from the second Battle of Verdun in summer 1917? The area around Hill 304, Esnan, Argonne, and the ravine.
Yes. There's not so much on Hill 304, but what is known as Mont Cornier. There are some quite extensive trench works there. And if one goes off into the woods, which is not always the easiest thing to do, if you go there in the autumn, you've got the sort of the boar hunting, the deer hunting. The best time to go there probably is sort of February and March, when all the vegetation has died back. And that's when you can begin to see things. But really, the French were very pragmatic about it. The battlefields have been largely converted back to farmland, and then they've grown forests. And it's in the forest that you find the remains. But of course, finding remains in forests can be quite problematic, but that's where it is. But certainly, there's a lot to be seen there. On Hill, there's a big memorial 304, and there's in what they call the Bois de Malincourt, which is close by Hill 304 to the west. There's a lot in there, and it sounds to me, I'm guessing from your accent, you're American. Is that right?
That's correct. Yes. Right.
Well, the Bois de Malincourt, of course, comes in to the Meuse-Argonne, the American Meuse-Argonne offensive in September. And there's an awful lot of American history in that particular area.
Yep. Wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Ian. Thanks, Mike, for your answering that one. Robert, do you want to just unmute yourself there?
Excellent. Yes, I enjoyed this very, very much. And I was fortunate a few years ago to get a tour of Verdun with Christina Holstein,
yes,
who we basically hired her for 3 days, and it was absolutely extraordinary. But I wanted to ask you, are there places that you've been which in your feeling are haunted, in the sense when you go there and you stand there, you get this feeling of, well, just an extraordinary, strange feeling? Because there were a couple of places in Verdun I remember distinctly thinking, this has still got electricity in it or something. I was just curious about that.
I mean, yes, there are, and I think we sort of sometimes take our own memories with us. Certainly, I mean, I'm always curious. The fact that I never hear birdsong in Verdun. It's a strange place, but yes, these places they are places of emotion. There is absolutely no doubt about it at all. Memory. But, as I said, I quoted that man John Lucy, "Devil from the Drum." I find because I take battlefield tours, and when I take parties there, I find that incredibly emotional. Merely because of you're just standing there. It's almost as if he's just alongside you, describing the landscape you're looking at.
Right. Yeah. I know.
There are those places. They're extraordinary. They really are.
Thanks for that, Robert.
Your talk make go back.
Years ago, there was you may have heard of him, a very well-known military historian, Richard Holmes, and I asked Richard one day, If he ever find himself getting corpsed, literally, when he was doing a battlefield presentation, he looked at me and said, "Dear boy, if I am not getting emotional, I'm not thinking about where I am."
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right.
Okay.
Well, thank you very much. It was extremely interesting.
Thank you.
Makes me want to go there. Makes me want to go
Robert.
there.
Thanks a lot. There's no more questions at this stage, everybody. So I'll just observe how much I particularly enjoyed listening, certainly about the Montan de Brine attack, which you quite rightly say is particularly underrated. But that whole area, Mike, is one of my favourite parts of the Western Front at the top of the Ardra Valley there. So thanks for showing us some stunning images, not only of the Montan de Brine but everywhere else. I've thoroughly enjoyed this evening's talk. Let me just see if there's some more questions coming in. Gordon's asked, are there any organised tours around the area, or do you have to make your own way around? Well, I know that Mike does do tours, but obviously not for the last year or so, Mike.
Well, I have to be honest, and I'm sorry if this turns into a commercial, but
not at all.
The only battlefield touring company who consistently do tours to this region is Battle Honours Tour, run by Clive Harris, who of course does the Western Front Association tours anyway.
Yeah.
Because it's not a very commercially profitable area. You cannot fill a coach to these areas. Which is really rather sad, because I just think they're fascinating. But Battle Honours, we do tour. I mean, we do regular tours to places like Meuse-Argonne, the Vosges, the Aisne, Champagne, Samia. We do tours that on a steady basis, but so that's it. But yes, otherwise you are basically on your own, and it's quite difficult to find your way. You know, it does take time. I mean, I spent 15 years getting to know these areas as part of my photographic project. So it's not the easiest of places to self-guide, shall we put it that way. You spend a fortune on maps, and that is a thing which I don't know if people realise, but the French IGN at the moment are in the process of renumbering their maps.
I didn't know that. So the IGN are renumbering.
It's a nightmare.
I can imagine. I can well imagine.
Nightmare.
Okay, well, I hope that answers your question, Gordon. But what we'll do is just to, if you just want to unmute yourself there, Judith, and
thanks for the this evening. I've really enjoyed the photographs. Some of them very emotive. I have been lucky enough to go into the Voge Mountains, but only specifically to certain areas. And obviously, due to the height of the terrain, the adverse winter weather, how did that affect the actual ability to have an attack, and also the supply chain? How did they get all the artillery or even food and stuff like that up into the hilltops in the Vosges? Because it is quite high up, isn't it? Quite high terrain.
The fighting in the Vosges, really, most of it was 1914-15, and then it died down because both sides realised that there was no real point in sort of trying a major attack at that. Hartmannswillerkopf was exceptional, and that was the one place where the fighting did continue. The Germans logistically was dead easy because they had their backs to the Rhine Valley, so they just basically had cable cars to get stuff up and wounded down and things like that. The French had a nightmare because they had to bring most of their materials and supplies across the Vosges. Their base effectively was a place called Epinal, and they used mules, and in the winter it was manpower. But it got so cold in the winter that effectively you were just basically trying to survive. And it was the winter of 15. In some places they had 10 meters of snow.
Yeah.
I mean, No, you just can't envisage it. It really can't.
No,
So
I mean, I was lucky enough to be there in the summer.
Yes.
And the views from some of the tops are just fantastic.
Yeah,
but
they are, aren't they?
it's one of those things that I couldn't sort of get into my head how you would have survived, as you say, when the snow came and the temperatures dropped, because it was just unimaginable how it must have been for both sides, really, at that point.
I think both sides during the winter, or there would be no point in fighting.
No.
And there are occasions when there was definitely live and let live. And you know, cold was far more important,
Yeah,
far greater threat than a bullet. So you know, sort of yes.
Okay, thanks. Thanks for that. I'm just going to fire through just a few final questions that have popped up, rather than inviting people to join as a panelist. I'll just fire through these off the screen. Julia Williams doesn't have a microphone or video, but asks if she can buy a book or view your work online. So is there a book or any of your work online, Mike?
Yes, if you Google, or if you go, I hate to say this, if you go to Amazon, Fields of Battle, Lands of Peace, 1418, there is a book, which I did. I'm not sure whether it's now still available, because if you have a door that blows open in the wind, this is a fantastic book to get. It weighs about 4.5 pounds. It is a good book, actually. I think he said modestly. No, it's a book of, if you like, of the landscapes of the First World War.
So just give everybody the title again, Mike.
Fields of Battle, Lands of Peace. Hang on a minute, I could just show you.
That is a significant looking piece of work there, Mike. So thanks for sharing that. So hopefully everybody's now got the idea of what you can find. Hopefully, if it's still available. Mark Gardner's said that he was lucky enough to tour recently with Mike before the pandemic, and has Mike visited the large Italian cemetery near Reims? I suspect the answer is yes, because that's at the foot of the Montan de Brine.
Yes,
so that's what Mark's talking about there. George Sutherland, am I right in understanding that elaborate German structures were because they were there to stay, while the French attitude was that it was just a temporary situation?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. And it was the same for the British. You know, you've got to get rid of the enemy, and for the French, the enemy, the Germans, were on la terre sacrée, so they had to get rid of them. Whereas the Germans merely wanted to sort of like husband their resources and lose as few men as possible, just holding that ground.
Sure enough. Last couple of questions, because it's now fast approaching the bewitching hour of 9:30. So Steve asks, at the Swiss border, was there a physical barrier separating the trenches from the Swiss countryside?
That I do not know. I think it just literally ended at. The Swiss army certainly had units there, because there is a well-documented story that on a Sunday, the Swiss army used to march a band down to where the two lines met their border, and the band would play music.
Wow. Right. Okay, thanks for that. Ian, who we met earlier, Ian Ferrance, just asked a supplementary question here. If there's time for a second question, what is being done to protect these natural monuments in situ, besides not sharing knowledge with untrustworthy folk, ironically? Are there organisations in place to patrol them, etc.? It seems like such a huge area to preserve on the whole, but I was struck by the lack of graffiti and vandalism.
The answer is German memorials have no protection whatsoever, because they are German memorials on French soil. But there is a move to regard them as part of, you know, mutual European history from that point of view. And the thing I would say is that, you know, whatever you do, be very careful if you go to France, do never, ever take a metal detector, because if the French gendarmerie find you with a metal detector on a battlefield, you will walk home. They don't mess about. You will walk home. They'll confiscate your car.
My word, that's something to be aware of. Peter has just mentioned that your book is still available on Amazon at £41.77. So £41.77 from Amazon.
And cheaper at half the price.
And that's splendid. Yeah, hopefully that's in good nick.
Price, I should say.
Hopefully that's in good nick. Right, one of the last questions, the questions are still coming in. Andrew Willison, hello Andrew. Would trenches established 28 feet apart be the result of live and let live before the real fighting took place?
Oh, no. This was, the point is, if you're on a mountain, if you decide to retreat from your particular position on the crest of the hill, you've probably got to go back a mile, 500 or 600 meters, because whoever possesses the crest of that hill has then got a clear view over it. So the crest of a mountain becomes a very, very contested ground on battlefields. And of course, for the French, retreat was not a consideration. It was la terre sacrée. They were giving up their soil to the invader. So that's why they would fight so fiercely for that ground. And cling onto it. So mountain warfare does have this tendency to produce. You have the same thing in northern Italy, as David will testify. You have this extraordinary people clinging to cliffs, literally to hold that area.
Absolutely. Mike, it's now 9:30, and I do like to call a halt at this particular time rather than take advantage of your good nature and go on much longer. So, okay, ladies and gentlemen, if we can just undertake a final round of applause back via the button underneath. Mike, I can tell, I know you can't hear it, but I can see it, and there's hundreds of hands going up as a round of applause for what you told us tonight. I know we've had a very full house. We had 492 people at peak, plus another 120 on Facebook. So you've had well over 600 people watching the presentation. So I thoroughly enjoyed it. And it's been a pleasure to be able to virtually visit these places on the Western Front, on the French sector of the Western Front, which hopefully we'll be able to do in real life before too long.
Yeah. Mike, thank you very much, and I look forward to meeting some of you in a muddy corner of a French field in the very near future, and all stay safe.
That's a good note to end it on. Thanks very much. Thanks everybody for watching. Webinar next Monday at 8 PM, Gary Sheffield. If you haven't registered, please do so. And as Mike said, stay safe. Thanks very much, Mike. All the best. Good night, everybody.
Mademoiselle from Armentiers, parlez-vous. Mademoiselle from Armentiers, parlez-vous. Mademoiselle from Armentiers, she hasn't been kissed for 40 years. Hickey, picky, parlez-vous.